As I record this today in San Jose, the weather almost hit 80 degrees, so you know that summer is coming. And are you ready? Do you have your summer wardrobe ready, or is it just whatever you wore last year? Update your summer wardrobe with Quince. You can get 100% European linen shirts, and dresses from $30, luxe swimwear, Italian leather, platform sandals, and much more. The best part? Everything with Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than what you'd find at similar brands. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen, Quince gives you luxury without the markup. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. I'll be breaking out that short sleeve linen shirt that I have pretty soon. And what will you get? Treat your closet to a little summer glow up with Quince. Go to quince.com/traveler for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you're looking for another podcast to listen to, we have a new show for you called Tim Green's Nothing Left Unsaid podcast. Hosted by former NFL linebacker, TV commentator, and New York Times bestselling author Tim Green and his son Troy, this podcast takes you behind the typical travel tales into extraordinary lives of people who've redefined adventure. In episode 57, featuring Steve Hafner, CEO and founder of Kayak.com, you'll discover how childhood experiences of constant travel inspired Steve to create one of the world's most successful travel companies. Imagine moving from Peru to Guatemala, Costa Rica, and beyond, all before adulthood, and turning that global perspective into a billion-dollar idea. Steve shares candid stories about entrepreneurship, the challenges he overcame from launching Kayak to navigating the impacts of 9/11 and COVID on the travel industry, and practical insights how anyone can turn innovative ideas into reality. If you love travel and want to learn how someone's life's journeys shape success and resilience, this episode is a must listen. Find Nothing Left Unsaid with Steve Hafner on your favorite podcast app today. Again, that's Nothing Left Unsaid, because every journey has a story. Amateur Traveler, episode 943. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about islands, coastal walks, and volcanoes, museums, parks, and lots more volcanoes as we go to Auckland, New Zealand. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Auckland. I'd like to welcome back to the show Jonty Crane, who's come to talk to us about Auckland, New Zealand. Jonty, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for letting me come back.
And I say welcome back. He was on just recently doing a wonderful episode on Timor-Leste. This time we're going to go much closer to home, though, and talk about Auckland. You are from New Zealand. Are you from Auckland?
So I'm originally from the UK. That's my kind of accent, but I moved to New Zealand, Auckland in 2010, and I lived there for 10 years. And then I moved down to Wellington, where I am now, but I've often gone back and visited Auckland. So I think I had 10 years to explore the city, and so I know it pretty well.
Excellent. And why should someone go to Auckland, New Zealand?
So many people go to New Zealand, but very few spend any time in Auckland. And I think when they do, they might just go down Queen Street or downtown, and they don't really get to see the beauty of Auckland that I've enjoyed whilst living here. New Zealand's a third of the population live in Auckland, a 1 in 3 chance of meeting an Aucklander. And it's just an interesting city. It's a bit like a little sister or brother to Sydney in Australia, but with some unique kind of New Zealand characteristics. So there's over 50 extinct volcanoes. It's between 2 natural harbours. There's some very beautiful islands which are accessible from the CBD. And it's also got excellent restaurants, museums, art galleries, and beaches. So it's definitely a place worth spending some time.
50 extinct volcanoes in the city of Auckland.
With the city built on top of, most of the planning restrictions have meant that they've kept most of the more prominent volcanic cones free of development. And so you can go up the top of these volcanoes and get beautiful views out. Now, they are all extinct, but the most recent was only 600 years ago, so fairly new.
Interesting. Excellent. What itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
So I'm going to give you a bit of a variety of things to do and see. So I'll start off a little bit talking about some of the islands in the Hauraki Gulf, which are all accessible from Auckland CBD, and then talk a little bit about some of the hiking, some of the other activities you can do, like jumping off one of the tallest buildings in the Southern Hemisphere or kayaking across the volcanoes. So those are all quite unusual things for a major city. And then I'll talk about more of the sort of things you'd expect to find in a big city in terms of the art galleries and the museums, some of the inner suburbs, and some day trips, and then finish up with talking a bit about where you can eat, where you can stay, and how to get around.
Sounds good.
So, starting off with the islands. So, the Hauraki Gulf, I think it is part of the Auckland region. So, the Auckland region is geographically quite large. And although it is a city of 1.5 million people, 1.7 million now, actually, when I live, is very fast growing. So 1.7 million people city. So you think, oh, big city. And yes, there is big city stuff, but there's also some beautiful spots you can get away to where you'll see almost no one. So the most, I guess, popular island in the Hauraki Gulf to go to is Waiheke. That is world famous for its vineyards. So if you're a wine lover or a connoisseur of good food, that is a must go to whenever celebrities come to New Zealand. So like Beyonce did a concert in New Zealand a few years ago. The promotion part of the council there, they put on trips for the celebs, and they always take them to Waiheke Island. It's the kind of classic place to go to for a day. It's 40 minutes by ferry from downtown. The downtown ferry terminal is right in the middle of the CBD. And if you've got some money, there's lots of tours you can do, but there's also hop-on, hop-off buses which go between the vineyards, so you can explore a number of different places, and there are some beautiful beaches as well on the island. I think my favourite would be Onitangi, which is on the northern side of the island, and it's this classic kind of beautiful sandy, couple of kilometre long beach with hukakawa trees, which are native to New Zealand. And they're called the New Zealand Christmas tree because around sort of December, January time, they have all these beautiful red flowers. And so you've got these trees covered in this really intense, beautiful red flowers. And yeah, that's the kind of native Christmas tree is the kind of term for it. So Waiheke Island is like a must see, I guess, if you're going to spend any time in Auckland. The volcano, the 600-year-old volcano I just mentioned earlier, is Rangitoto, and that is an icon of the city because you can see it from pretty much anywhere. So when you look from the city towards the harbour, there's this kind of very distinctive kind of volcano kind of shape object in the harbour, and that you can visit on a day trip by a ferry. And there's some interesting, you can walk up to the summit and get great views around, or you can do a walk around the base of it. And it's interesting because it's very volcanic. So it's new and it's got quite an interesting history. So, for example, some of the prisoners, Auckland prison, I think back in the 30s, they got shipped over to the island to build a tennis court for the residents on the island. You can imagine trying to build a flat piece of land on volcanic rock is quite difficult. So they needed a bit of prison muscle to get that done. And it's a good spot for native birds. And one of the sort of little gems I'll share on here, which not many people know about, is so on Rangitoto, there's a thing called batches. So in New Zealand, a batch or a crib on the South Island is a holiday home. And so batches are a big part of sort of New Zealand culture. People have these places they go to for their weekends or for their holidays. And so in the 1920s, 1930s, a lot of batches were built around Rangitoto. And they're real old school Kiwi batches. So, there's no power. They might have a drop toilet. They're pretty basic. In the architecture, you can see how somebody just knocked it up themselves without any kind of planning consent or rules. And so they're quite atmospheric and got a lot of character. A number of them are still survived and they're passed down through family members. But there are 3 available that you can stay in. So I think if you go through bookabatch.com or co.nz, you can find these heritage batches. And they're probably about 80 or 90 New Zealand dollars a night. So that's not much. It's probably like 50 US bucks. And you get to basically stay on this volcanic island and pretty much have the place to yourself. So when I went over last time I did it, I walked up to the summit for sunset. There was nobody at the summit. And then on the walk down, heard lots of native bird life. I went swimming, and the waters there was nice and warm and just beautifully clear waters. So it's a really memorable experience spending the day. You don't often get to sleep overnight on a volcano. And there's also Motutapu Island, which is an island. There's a short causeway between the volcanic island of Rangitoto and Motutapu, and that's home to lots of native bird life, and it's good for walking. So that's a thing you can only really do in New Zealand that I've come across in Auckland, is go to this volcano. And then my third island I'll suggest is called Tiritiri Matangi. And that is one of the, this rolls off the tongue, is one of the best places in New Zealand to see native birds. I've lived in New Zealand for 15 years. I've seen a lot of native bird sanctuaries, and Tiritiri Matangi has got beautiful, lots of bellbirds, lots of tui, just really full of life. And what's quite good is the island is a bit of a success story. That it was at one point it was farmed, and it was all cut down for kind of pasture. And then over the last 20, 30 years, they've basically replanted all these native plants on the island, and they've reintroduced native birds. And because all the growth is quite new, the birds are all basically at eye height. So if you go into original native forest that hasn't been logged, the canopy is quite high up, and it can be quite hard to see the birds. But on Tiritiri, you can, it's very easy to see the birds. There's an old lighthouse keeper's house that you can actually stay in overnight, again, if you want to do an overnight trip. So that I'd also recommend definitely as a day trip. I think it's 80 minutes by ferry from downtown Auckland. So you go out in the morning, spend the day there, come back. It's a wonderful place to visit.
Okay.
So those are my sort of three top islands I'd suggest. So you could easily spend 3 days on those, or you could probably do Waiheke and Rangitoto in a day at a push. Tiritiri is a sort of all-day kind of trip. Then in terms of some of the hiking opportunities, so you can have bragging rights to say you have walked from the Pacific Ocean to the Tasman Sea, if you so wish. There's not many places you can do that. Auckland is an isthmus, and then you look at it on the map, and you've got Northland, and then it really narrows down to a very narrow point. At the narrowest point, I think, is only about 1 kilometre wide, and then it broadens up to the rest of the North Island. And so there's a marked trail called the Coast to Coast, and that goes from the CBD and the harbour there on the Hauraki Gulf on the Pacific Ocean, and then you walk south, and then you end up to the Manukau Harbour, which is on the Tasman Ocean. So that's going across to Australia. And you might think, 16K walk across a city may not be so appealing, but the route actually takes you past some of the volcanic cones, some of the parks, some heritage sites. It's an interesting way to see the city. And then you can just get a bus back quite easily, or train actually from Onehunga back to the CBD. So that's if you want a sort of city walk thing that isn't all just CBD, that's a good option, the coast to coast.
I'm going to make sure we define CBD here, because it's not a term that everyone from the U.S. is familiar with, but we're talking about the Central Business District.
Yeah, downtown,
Yep.
City centre, So CBD, it's probably a New Zealand, Australia term.
It's used all over the place, so I think a lot of people knew exactly what you're talking about, but don't want to leave anybody out here.
Excellent, thank you. If you want something with a bit more coastal scenery, so there's a thing called the North Shore Coastal Walk. So Auckland, a bit like Sydney, has a North Shore. And so from the CBD, there's a harbour bridge. It's not as impressive as the Sydney Harbour Bridge, but there is a harbour bridge. And unfortunately, you can't walk over it. You can only drive over it. But you can easily get a bus to the North Shore. And then there's this beautiful coastline that goes up to 30 kilometres. So you could do a really decent walk along there. And you're basically going from Devonport, and then you go to Takapuna, and you can go all the way up to Long Bay, which is a reserve at the top. And you've got beautiful beaches with very good swimming. They're quite calm, so they're good for swimming. They're not surfing spots really, but they're just ideal for swimming. Nice sandy beaches. And then there's generally a little bit of headland, and you come down, and then there's pretty much most of the beaches would have cafes or little towns behind them. And there's a bit of a coastal walk, so you're basically walking along the coast the whole way. So that's just a nice thing to do on a good day. And again, you don't have to do the whole thing, but you could just do the Devonport to Takapuna section, or just pick a section that you like, and you can start and end with a nice cafe and do a bit of walking and see the sea and go for a swim. And then the third one is the Waikowhai Walkway. It's probably the trip notes. You may need to look at the spelling. And
for everybody else, these will be in the show notes. It's just pity me as I'm trying to find them all. But
So this is on the Manukau Harbour, so that's on the Tasman Sea, and it's a 10-kilometre coastal walk, but it's quite a different feel. So the North Shore Coastal Walk is idyllic beaches for swimming and backed by quite a lot of housing up there. The one along the Manukau Harbour is more rugged, it's more tidal. There's quite a lot of kind of estuary birds that you might see around there. You want to do it at low tide, ideally, because some of the sections you can do shortcuts or best accessible at low tide. And then there's a lot of native bush, and it's more your classic kind of New Zealand bush feel behind. If you don't have the time or the capacity to go out to some of the national parks in New Zealand, this is like a little bit of a taster, and it's in central Auckland, and not many people know about it, and so that's a good one to explore if you want to go for a proper kind of day hike.
Okay.
Then some other activities you can do in Auckland that might be a bit different to other cities. So the Sky Tower is another landmark on the skyline, although if you've been to Macau in China, they also have a Sky Tower, which was designed by the same architect and looks identical, which I was very confused by when I landed in Macau. I was like, hang on a moment, I've seen that's in Auckland. Why is there one there?
Now, that must be fairly new in Macau because it wasn't there when I was there.
I got very confused in Macau because I was following Google Maps, but what was sea on Google Maps was land in reality because they kept doing all this reclamation. And so I got very confused. I was like one block from the ocean, but the ocean, so you've got to be careful with Macau because it does develop very quickly. So the Sky Tower is the tallest structure in the Southern Hemisphere, or it was until I Googled it this morning. And in Jakarta, the Autograph Tower was built in 2022, and that is slightly higher. But for a long time, it was built in the 90s, I believe, and it had bragging rights. And it was unusual that the tallest structure was in New Zealand, not in Australia, for example. So it's a big pointy thing, basically, that's designed, looks a bit like a syringe, a hypodermic needle. And it's designed, it's got a rotating restaurant at the top. And some of the activities you can do, they call it the Sky Jump, which is I guess they called it a controlled skydive. So you jump off from 192 meters up towards the concrete, and you're on a wire. So you go pretty fast, and then the wire in the harness slows you down so you don't splat on the concrete. So it's not for me, but that's something.
Again, this is one of those what one can do.
One can, if so wishes. And there's also, I don't like heights, but there's a thing called the Sky Walk. And again, you put on a harness and you're attached to a railing, and you basically walk around the top. And at one point, I believe in the tour, they encourage you to put your feet on the edge of the building and to lean backwards. And I would never do that. But again, if one has got a head for heights, that might be something of interest.
See, I remember just having a hard time because they had plexiglass that you could stand on and look straight down within the tower, not being on the outside or whatever. And my brain did not want to do that.
No. And I've seen these great clips on Instagram where in China, they've got these bridges with glass bottom bridges.
Yeah.
And they've put these special effects lights in. So when somebody treads on it, it makes a cracking noise and all these cracks go across the glass. And
seen those.
People are freaking out. Yeah. Luckily, these ones don't do
Which
that.
Which is just mean, but hilarious. But
Now, I just know they've recently opened an exhibition at the base of the Sky Tower called Weta Workshop Unleashed. So if you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings movies or the Hobbit movies or even Avatar, so Weta Workshop is owned by Sir Peter Jackson, and it does all the special effects. And so all the models and the miniatures. So they've got an expedition at the bottom there where you can see a lot of those kind of things that we use in Lord of the Rings. So that might be of interest as well.
So if you're not going to get to Wellington where you could actually tour Weta itself, this would be a great alternative.
Correct. Yeah, it's similar. It's a very similar thing to Weta Workshop in Wellington.
Okay.
Then, as I mentioned earlier, you've got Rangitoto, which you can get the ferry out to and spend the night. Now, another option is you can take a kayak out there. There's quite a lot of sea kayaking options, and you kayak out at sunset, which would be beautiful. A friend of mine is a mad keen kayaker, and I see these amazing photographs he takes on the water of the harbour at sunset. So that's an option. And you go as a group, so it's safe, and they've got lights on the back of the kayak so the ferries don't run into you. And so that's quite an interesting thing you can do. And there's also Motokorea/Browns Island, which is closer. And that's uninhabited, and it's another one of these volcanic cones. There's this little island, and you can walk up to the summit and get nice views out, and that's quite a nice little kayak adventure as well. So if you're into kayaking or just want to get out in the water, that's a good option. If you want to see a show, although Wellington is the arts capital of New Zealand, Auckland is 4 times the size of Wellington. So it just, per capita, it just has more artsy kind of stuff. So when big shows come to town, when bands come, like I say, Beyonce or Metallica or any kind of big name acts, they will play in Auckland. And a couple of the venues I'd recommend if you're coming to Auckland to see what's on.
I'm conscious this year that we only get our mothers for so long. This is the second Mother's Day I'm spending without my mom. And how do you give a gift that says that to this person that you love so much? Sure, you could send flowers or maybe a card like always, but named the best digital photo frame by Wirecutter, Aura Frames are guaranteed to mix things up this year. Aura Frames come with unlimited storage so you can share as many photos as you want from your phone to mom's Aura Frame. Not only will she be grateful that it's not another card, she'll also love that an Aura Frame means she gets to see more of you. And maybe also of those special grandkids or even that puppy. Aura has a great deal for Mother's Day. For a limited time, listeners can save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off plus free shipping on their best-selling Carver matte frame. That's Aura, A-U-R-A, frames.com, promo code TRAVELER. Support the show by mentioning us at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. I think you'll love it. I love mine, and I have it set up right in front of me as I record this. And thanks to Aura Frames for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Summer is just around the corner, and the folks at Mint Mobile have a hot take. Getting a summer bod is out, and getting your savings bod is in. This spring and summer, we want skimpy wireless bills and fat wallets. And with premium wireless plans for just $15 a month, you can have both without breaking a sweat or the bank. Mint Mobile uses exactly the same towers on the nation's largest 5G network that I was using before switching to Mint Mobile. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text. Say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, and unexpected overages. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get your summer savings and shop premium wireless plans at mintmobile.com/traveler. That's mintmobile.com/traveler. Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5 GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. And thanks to Mint Mobile for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
If there are any shows on at the Civic is one of, I think there's only about a dozen left in the world, of what they called atmospheric theatres. And they built these in the 1920s. And the idea was you'd be inside a building, but you'd feel like you were outside. And they have the most unusual architecture you've ever seen. It's this real mishmash of Egyptian hieroglyphics and like elephants and palm trees and just this really unusual, fascinating combination of things. If there isn't a show on, I believe you can do tours behind the scenes, which is what I have done in the past. And that's fascinating because you get to see how the theatre worked and you hear about the restoration. I think there was a big restoration project in the 90s, I believe, to bring it back to life. And the best thing about the theatre is before any of the shows start, so the lights fall and the stars light up. So the entire scene of this theatre, this is like an 1,800 person theatre, it's a big theatre. They've done a exact replica of, imagine if there wasn't a roof to the theatre, you would be looking and there was a clear night. All the stars are lit up. They're all using LEDs and they've all got exactly the right luminance based on the stars. And then you get these cloud patterns come over and there's a shooting star and then dawn happens and the stars disappear and the show starts. It's magical. And I think there are a few in the US, but they're a bit of a rare breed. And so definitely the Civic is a wonderful place to visit. And then if you want the opposite end of that, more kind of cutting edge artsy theatre, just behind the Civic is a place called the Basement Theatre. And as the name suggests, it's pretty much in a basement and it's quite small. It's about 80 people capacity, but the tickets tend to be very cheap. There's always stuff happening there. It's a very trendy place to go. I'd say that. A lot of the kind of the cool cats will be hanging out at the basement theatre. And again, it's probably not on most tourist itineraries, but they've always got shows on, 1 or 2 shows every night of the week pretty much. And it will just give you a bit of a flavour for what life, if you're living in Auckland, this is what the locals will go and do and see.
Okay.
Then in terms of cycling, so Auckland is a fantastic place for cycling. Around the waterfront is flat. You can pretty much actually, a lot of the volcanoes, you have got road access to the top, so you can actually cycle your bike to the top of a volcanic cone, which is quite cool. And you can hire e-bikes. So there's a number of different operators, particularly down by the waterfront in the CBD, where you can hire e-bikes from. The top cycle I'd recommend for visitors would be along Tamaki Drive. So you go from the city centre and you head out east, and it goes through, there's Mission Bay, there's Curry and the St Heliers, and those are beautiful coastal suburbs. They've got nice beaches, good for swimming. They've all got good cafes behind them, and there's a dedicated cycling path that goes along the waterfront. So you get beautiful ocean views. You can stop off and get a decent coffee or an ice cream wherever you want, and that's a nice kind of thing to do for a half day or a full day whilst you're in town.
Okay.
And then the last of the sort of activities, this one needs a bit of planning. You have to book well in advance, and the transport, the only way to really book it is they do a lot of charity events. So there's a place called Gibbs Farm Sculpture Park. Now, Mr. Gibbs is one of the wealthiest people in New Zealand. He made a lot of money from the deregulation of businesses in the 80s. And he's put a lot of his money, he's invested back into this private farm. So it's not publicly accessible, but he does a lot of charity events. So if you Google for Gibbs Farm Sculpture Park tours, that he does a lot of charity events that you can pay, and then you can go and see his sculpture farm. And this has got world-class sculptures. Like this has got like Anish Kapoor, who's a very well-known British kind of Indian sculptor. The largest sculpture he ever built is in this place. It's off the top of my head, it's something like 50 meters long. It's a huge
thing.
It
looks like a lot of huge things. Yeah.
And Richard Serra, who's a famous sculptor in like sheet metal. And then you've got Anthony Goldsworthy. And so if you're into art and particularly sculptures, this has got world-class sculptures, and it's quite a interesting place to visit. And he also has his own personal zoo, which I think has like emus. And you're like, I was looking and I was going, is that an ostrich statue? Oh no, it's moved. It's not a piece of artwork. It's an actual ostrich. Okay, got you. So that's, again, it's probably not on most tourist itineraries, but if you're interested in art, then Gibbs Farm Sculpture Park is a great place to visit.
Okay.
Then if we go into the CBD, so there's the Auckland War Memorial Museum, and that is quite an impressive neoclassical building, which interestingly was built in 2 halves. So they built half of it in the 1920s, and they ran out of money, and then they built the other half in the 1950s, and it all matches up. It's got 3 floors. So the top floor, it was built as a war memorial to World War One. So there's a lot of information about Gallipoli and the Anzacs in the First World War. The second floor is more your nature and your native animals, and there's this great, very popular exhibition about earthquakes, and so that's got kind of natural sciences. And then the ground floor is a really good place to see Maori culture. They do cultural shows on a daily basis, I believe, and they've got lots of Maori sculpture. And it's also got one of the best collections I've seen of artifacts from the Pacific, particularly from places like Papua New Guinea, which I love Papua New Guinea. And the costumes they wear for festivals are just, fascinating to see. And there was one, I think it was from Kiribati. It was a suit of armor, but Pacific style. So rather than being like metal and chainmail, it was all made of woven animal or like plant fabric. And the sword, so the blade of the sword was made of shark teeth. Huh. So imagine 50 shark teeth along a stick. That's the sword. I don't tend to see things like that very often. Auckland War Memorial Museum is a very good museum. The other museum I probably recommend is the Maritime Museum, which is right down at the waterfront at the Viaduct. Because Auckland is called the City of Sails. That's its tagline. And you go there, the harbour, there's a lot of yachts. There's a lot of people with boats. And also it hosted the America's Cup on a number of occasions. So if you want to go and see the history of the America's Cup, and we've got one of the old New Zealand America's Cup boats, Sir Roger Blake, who was famous for his Red Sox, and he helped win the Cup for New Zealand. And they've got a lot of the traditional sailing boats, and then also some Maori Pacific kind of Polynesian sailing boats as well. So that's quite good for anybody who's into kind of maritime things.
Now, the one museum that I recall that my kids and I enjoyed was the Motat.
Yes,
Museum.
Motat. Yes, so that is just outside of town. Yeah, that's excellent. Motat is Museum of Transport and Technology. So if anybody's interested in trams and planes and railways, that is a good place to visit. It's home to the only Solent flying boat left in the world. So this was the plane that used to fly between New Zealand and Australia with Teal. So the national airline, Air New Zealand, when it first was, it was called Teal, which was something like
Tasman Empire Airways Limited.
You were on it, yeah. Oh, you just Googled that, or was that off your head?
No, that is not off the top of my head.
I was quite impressed then. So that was the origin of Air New Zealand. And so that was the flying boat that used to connect New Zealand with Australia. And I think if you were going to fly from like the UK, you'd do 5 stops all the way to New Zealand. You go across Europe, you get into Singapore, then you go Singapore down to Darwin, then you go Darwin down to Sydney, and you go Sydney down to Auckland. So you're right, yeah, Motat is worth doing. It's probably a bus ride away out of the CBD. A good museum to visit. In terms of art galleries, so there's the Auckland Art Gallery, which is one of the largest in the country. It's in a beautiful building, very central, very good collection of New Zealand artists, and it has a very high turnover of displays. So every month there's something that's changed there. So that's definitely worth a visit in town. There's also a little bit further out of town, there's a place called the Pa Homestead Art Gallery, and that is a beautiful, I think at the time it was the largest private house in Auckland, and it's got this big sort of turret set up, and it's now quite a nice art gallery with a good cafe. So that's, if you're into art, those are good, two good places to visit. There are some nice gardens. There are botanic gardens in Auckland, but they're in Manukau, which is, it's a little bit tricky to get to unless you've got your own car. And they're nice, but they were developed in the 1980s. They're not as historic as some of the ones like in Christchurch. Botanic Gardens are very central and are probably more impressive. But near the War Memorial Museum is the Auckland Domain. So that is the park that surrounds it. And that, again, is another volcanic cone. Some of the volcanoes are really obvious. Some are less obvious. But, yeah, that's another volcanic cone. And there's what are called the Winter Gardens there. And so these are 2 beautiful greenhouses. They're tropical greenhouses, and they're very good for if you ever want to do a selfie for Instagram, or very colourful flowers. And, yeah, they're very nice places to visit. So I'd recommend those. Also in town, in terms of parks, the Auckland Art Gallery backs onto Albert Park, which is a beautiful, I think it's one of the oldest parks in New Zealand. And there's some statues of various Victorian alumni. And obviously Albert Park is named after Albert from Victorian Albert, Victoria times. And so that's a nice place just to stroll around. Somewhere that's a bit unusual is towards the top end of town, the top end being physically on up the hill. So the centre of town.
Not the north end of town, but the highest end of town. Okay.
Correct. You go south. So the Auckland CBD, the water is to your north, and then it's sea level. And then you basically, if you walk south, you go uphill. So the top end of town, which is at the southern end of the town, is Simon Street Cemetery. So this is one of the oldest cemeteries in the country. It was active from 1842 to 1866. And Hobson, who's one of the first governors of New Zealand, and there's lots of other famous from New Zealand history, are buried in Simon Street Cemetery. And it's very atmospheric. It's one of these places where it's not particularly well maintained. I wouldn't go there at night, but lots of the tombs are all falling down or a bit collapsed, and we're slightly unusually. So in the 1960s, they actually built a motorway through the center of the cemetery, and then they dug up something like 4,000 corpses, and they re-interned them elsewhere in the cemetery to put the motorway in. And they did the same thing in Wellington. Like, you can't imagine it happening these days, but that's what happened. So there is some weird there's Grafton Bridge, which is a bridge that goes across the gully where the motorway is now. There's tombstones attached to the bridge infrastructure because that's where the tomb was. And then they built the bridge, and they thought, well, we'll keep the tomb in the same place, so we'll just tip the gravestone and attach it to the side of the bridge. So it's a bit eerie and unusual, and yeah, it's something, again, that's not on your typical tourist trail, but Simon Street Cemetery, if you like cemeteries, is a very atmospheric example of one. And then to go to somewhere a bit more modern, Yard Quarter was developed for the Rugby World Cup in 2011. And so you go downtown to the waterfront, and you basically you go to the west. And because the area was very industrial and there was lots of storage tanks for oil and diesel and things being brought into the city. And then over the last 10, 20 years, they've really gentrified the whole area, and there's a big master plan, and they've built parkland, playgrounds and apartment buildings. And so it's one of the up and coming areas of the city. And there's quite a lot of places to eat and drink there. And it's got one of the best children's playgrounds in the city for that. There's a random bridge to nowhere. You go up this structure, which is 3 stories tall. It doesn't go anywhere. You go up it, and it's got lots of steps, and then there's nice views, and you go down it again. And a lot of the silos have now put these great big sort of street murals on the side of the silos. It's just a nice place to wander around on a nice day. It's won lots of awards internationally as a really good example of how you regenerate a waterfront without starting from scratch. So a lot of waterfronts are all just brand new. What they've done here is they've kept a lot of the heritage industrial components, and then they've added the new stuff. So it's this kind of interesting mixture of the two. So yeah, Wynyard Quarter is worth a visit. Also close to the city, if you're into churches, there's the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, which is in Parnell's suburb, which is 10-15 minutes by bus or train to the east of the CBD. And it's the real old money. So Parnell is where the old money was. And so there's some very nice houses there. It's very expensive real estate. And there's the new, it's probably, I think, 1970s cathedral, which has got a very nice water facade. But next to it is Old St. Paul's. And this was actually, I think it was across the road. But one of the advantages in New Zealand, the old churches in New Zealand, and a lot of the churches in New Zealand are built of timber. And
Sure.
A, they're good from an earthquake perspective, but B, they're easy to move. So this church actually used to be like 100 meters away, and then they put a road in. They were like, oh, the church is in the way. We'll just jack the church up onto some props, and we'll just shift it to the left, and then we can build our road. So they moved this church across. And if anybody's been to Wellington, the old St. Paul's in Wellington, it's a very similar style. It's this beautiful Gothic wooden church, again, very atmospheric, very popular for weddings. And that is in Parnell. So those are probably my top churches.
It reminds me of some of the churches in Normandy that look like they were built by shipbuilders, because it really has this upside-down ship look to it.
Exactly, and all the timbers, they're beautiful structures. So that's definitely worth a visit. In terms of the volcanoes, we talked about a few. So we talked about Rangitoto. There's the island volcano you can go out to. Of all the other volcanoes, I think I have done a blog post actually, like, what are my favourite volcanoes in Auckland? I guess my top ones would be, so Mount Eden is the highest natural point, I guess, in Auckland, the highest volcano. That's 196 metres above sea level, which interestingly is basically the same height as the Sky Tower. So you can get the same sort of views as the Sky Tower without going up the Sky Tower. But the only thing with the Mount Eden is I think they've now closed off road access to the summit. So you can drive up to a certain point and then you need to walk up the remainder. But that is got phenomenal views of the city. And in the middle of it is the old crater. So you see the old volcanic crater at the bottom. It would have had probably a lake originally. That's a bit older than Rangitoto, but that's a very good viewpoint. And then probably my favourite volcano, because it was the closest one to where I used to live, is called One Tree Hill, or Mangakiki. And that's 182 metres above sea level. So it's not quite as high, but it's pretty much slap bang in the centre of the Auckland Isthmus. So when you're at the top of that, you get 360-degree views of the entirety of Auckland. And it's also got a bit of history because it's part of Cornwall Park, which is one of the biggest parks in Auckland. And it's just beautiful. It's really good for running and cycling. And weirdly, but they also have animals in the park. So they have sheep. It's very New Zealand that in the middle of the biggest city, because I remember I was cycling to work one day and it happened to be the day when they were moving the sheep from one part of the park to another part of the park. I was going quite fast on my bike and I came around a corner to this flock of sheep and I nearly got taken out. Like I nearly had a crash into a sheep. And I thought only in New Zealand would I run into a sheep in the middle of the biggest city in the country. And there's cow, and they do, so there is certain areas of the park are still used for farming, and then other areas have been given over kind of native plants and animals and things like that. And there's a bit of a story about it, because One Tree Hill, for many years, there was no tree on the summit. So One Tree Hill, it was basically an introduced West sort of colonials, but they brought over lots of kind of species. And there was this tree, and it was the only tree left on top of the volcano. It was quite a distinctive silhouette. And if anybody's a fan of U2, they've got a song on the Joshua Tree album called One Tree Hill, which was in honor of, they had a Kiwi roadie who died, and then they wrote this song about them. So that's also popularized One Tree Hill. Then there was a Maori activist was protesting against something with a chainsaw. And so he took a chainsaw to the one tree on top of the hill. And then it was No Tree Hill for many years. And then what they've done more recently is they've planted, I think, 9 trees, all native species. The reason it took a long time, there was a lot of debate about what are we going to replace it with? Are we going to do the same? And so they ended up putting 9 different native species of trees on top. And then the idea is they will all grow up, because you can't just plant one tree because it will die. It's a very exposed site. So they planted, I think, 9. And then as they grow, they'll see which of the ones is doing the best. And then ultimately they'll get back to the one tree hill that was there 20, 30 years ago.
You talk about being surprised to run into sheep in New Zealand. I see that the ratio of sheep to people in New Zealand is at an all-time low here at only 5 sheep per person. Where it was 22 at one time. So,
wow! Given the population using what 5.5 million, so that's 25 million sheep. It's still a lot of sheep, but cows, dairy has really taken over in the last little while. But that's what New Zealand was built on. The New Zealand economy, right, up until the 1960s, 70s, basically until the UK entered the European Union, sheep and wool exports was by far the mainstay of the economy. Things like the Korean War, because Korea is quite cold, there was this huge demand for woolen clothing, and so New Zealand did very well. It was one of the richest countries in the world up until the 60s or 70s, and then now it's quite a long way behind the US and the UK and Australia in terms of per capita. But agricultural land.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Llévate más de lo que esperas todos los días con el nuevo McValue en McDonald's. Ahora puedes comprar uno y sumarle otro por $1. Así que cuando tu equipo favorito enfrente a sus rivales, enfrenta a tus antojos con $5 Meal Deals. Y si estás corriendo para alcanzar el desayuno, corre al app para llevarte ofertas antes del cutoff. Tú decides, y con McValue, tu decisión siempre rinde más. Precios y participación pueden variar. BOGO $1 válido para un producto de igual o menor valor. Debe estar registrado en Rewards para ofertas en el app.
So that's the central parts of Auckland. A couple of other areas I might just talk about is the West Coast. They call it kind of the Wild West Coast. And this is quite different. And it's quite, again, one of the things I love about Auckland is the kind of natural beauty, which you expect from New Zealand, but a lot of visitors to Auckland, you land at the airport, you see a sort of city, and then you leave. But if you just do a little bit of exploring out to the islands or out to the Waitakeris out west, there's some beautiful natural landscape to see. So out west, there are the Waitakere Ranges, which are beautiful temperate rainforest. And there are a number of short and longer hikes through the forest. And then on the west coast are the West Coast beaches. So the East Coast and the beaches in the Hauraki Gulf I've talked about so far are very pleasant, sandy, swimming kind of beaches. The West Coast, I think that they're all black sand beaches. So they're all volcanic black sand. Now in summer, because black absorbs the heat versus a white sand beach, which reflects the heat. So you need to wear some jandals or thongs or whatever you want to call them on your feet, because the black sand is the hottest sand you'll ever tread on. And probably if you've been to Hawaii, you have experienced black sand. Right. And so there's I guess the best known ones are Piha, which is well known for surfing, but they've got a TV series here called Piha Surf Rescue. There's enough things happen that they have a whole TV series around rescuing people. So it's not for beginners, but if you're an experienced surfer, then Piha is a fantastic place for surfing. And then just to the north of that is Karikari. And that, if you've ever seen the film The Piano, which was a famous New Zealand film from the 90s, it won Oscars, that was filmed, and there's these scenes with this piano on this black sand beach and this huge waves coming in and all this temperate rainforest behind. That was filmed at Karikari. So that's just a really nice spot to walk, explore. There is a thing called the Tehenga Walkway, which is a fantastic coastal walk along that, which is very rugged coastline and fantastic views. I just checked and it closed late last year because there was a large slip. You can walk sections of it, but it's worth keeping an eye on. The Tehenga Walkway, if it's open, is a really good hike. And actually, if you're heading out west, Waitakere is the main town out west, and that has a very good art gallery called Te Uru, and that's definitely worth a visit if you're heading out there or heading back. It's got a very good cafe, and yeah, it's a very nice art gallery. So that's out west for something a bit more wild. You can even go canyoning. You can go canyoning in Auckland. Most people go down to Wanaka or Queenstown, but it is possible in the Waitakeres. And then for something a bit more sedate, you could head across to Devonport. So Devonport is a 10-minute ferry ride from the Auckland CBD, from the ferry terminal, and it's very much old school Auckland. So there's lots of beautiful heritage character villas with verandas, and it's very leafy and green, and the house prices are astronomical, but it's a very pleasant place to visit. So there you've got quite nice shops, and you've got some shops with a bit of character. There is Mount Victoria, another volcanic cone, which has got fantastic views of the Hauraki Gulf. There's quite an interesting museum, the Devonport Museum, about the history of Devonport. And there's a excellent, and I think it's free, the Torpedo Bay Naval Museum, which is the New Zealand Navy Museum. New Zealand isn't renowned for its museums, so that's definitely one of the better ones. And it's in a beautiful setting just below North Head. And North Head is another volcanic cone, and that is worth a visit because it's got a lot of, and actually Mount Victoria does as well, they've got gun emplacements. So
Okay.
New Zealand was very worried about Russia invading in the late 1800s. Because of the Victorian Empire, and Russia was encroaching, and you had the Great Game going on Central Asia, and so it was a legitimate fear that the Russians were going to invade New Zealand. It's a long way from Russia, and so there was quite a lot of money spent on quite large fortifications in both Auckland and in Wellington, and even on Motutapu Island next to Waiheke. There's some really quite large fortifications were built. And then the great worry during the Second World War was also the Japanese. So they built quite a lot of fortifications there. So there's a bit of history. There's some nice views. It's a nice place to visit. So Devonport, you could spend a whole day there, but probably half a day you could cover most things. And that's just a nice, pleasant trip out from the CBD.
Excellent.
So there's quite a lot to do. So that you could easily fill a week. But even if you've only got a couple of days, I think it's good to get anywhere. To get to New Zealand from pretty much anywhere is a long flight with quite a lot of jet lag. And so a lot of people will arrive and get off their plane after they're 12, or if you come from the UK, you could be flying for 28, 32 hours, and they get in a hire car and they hit the road, and maybe that's not the best idea. Maybe spend a few days, get over the jet lag, get some sleep, get some rest, do some stuff in Auckland, and then head on your way. There have been quite a lot of accidents with tourists driving on the wrong side of the road and being tired from jet lag. And yeah, it's a thing. So that's worth kind of considering when you think about your itinerary.
Yeah, I remember the second time I was there, where I was there for 2 weeks in a rental van, a RV or a caravan, if I want to speak New Zealand here.
Camper van.
Camper van. Okay. Caravan in England.
The caravan that you'd pull. You generally might say you'd pull a caravan.
Okay.
And a camper van drives itself, or it has its built into
then it was a camper van. Got it. I remember getting in the car and being very jet lagged and driving just out of Auckland and finding a parking lot, crawling in the back and sleeping because I knew that I didn't really want to be driving on the left much longer without some sleep.
Exactly. Yeah. And New Zealand has quite a lot of roundabouts. And if you're driving on the other side of the road and trying to tackle roundabouts and you're not 100%, it can be a challenge.
And this was in the early days of in-the-car navigation. I remember it was so early that at one point in the car navigation system somewhere in New Zealand put me in an infinite loop. This isn't working. So anyway, something where you wanted to be a little more awake.
Correct. And then if you're looking for places to rest up in Auckland, as imagine there's lots of hotels and places to stay. It's a big city. There's lots of options in the CBD, a couple which have got a bit more character. There's the usual kind of chain hotels, but Hotel Britomart is a heritage building they've converted into a very nice boutique hotel, and Hotel de Brett, which also has an excellent bar and quite a funky kind of place. So Hotel Britta Mart, they've got a bit of character and they're nice kind of boutique hotels. If you've got a car, obviously central Auckland and the ferries are easy to get out. And then there is a reasonable bus and train system to some of the inner suburbs. But if you're wanting to go out west to the Waiheke Ranges, or generally, New Zealand's got one of the highest rates of car ownership in the world. And if you are renting a car, it'd probably be easier, or probably it will be cheaper actually, because parking downtown can be $40 a day. So consider maybe getting like an Airbnb. And then some nice suburbs to stay in would be Mount Eden near the volcano, is a very nice suburb, or Ponsonby. Ponsonby is just to the west of the CBD, and that's a very trading suburb, and you can walk into town from there. It's a bit of a walk, but if you've got a car, parking might be a little bit easier, and that's quite a nice place to stay.
Okay.
In terms of places to eat, Auckland's got a really good food scene. It's very much this Pacific Rim cuisine where they've got all these influences. Auckland's got a huge Asian population. It's also got a huge Polynesian population. So more Polynesians live, I think, in Auckland than live in Polynesia. There is quite a range of cuisine. It was interesting because I used to live in the UK. The most popular lunch option was a sandwich. It's what you eat in the UK. You have a sandwich. When I came to Auckland, I was like, oh, okay, what am I going to get for lunch? Sushi. Sushi is the most popular lunch option in New Zealand, or certainly in Auckland, for lunch. So there's a lot of very good Asian restaurants. There's Commercial Bay, which is one of the tallest, I think, one of the tallest buildings in Auckland. It's a landmark on the waterfront, just behind the ferry terminal downtown. It's a new development. It's got quite a nice upmarket mall, but it also has a very nice food court. So that's a really good place if you just want to try lots of different things. There's a good food court there. Just to the east of that is Britta Mart, which is where that hotel I mentioned was earlier. Now that 20 years ago, that was very derelict and run down, and now it's very trendy. There's some very nice boutique clothes shops. There's some very nice places to eat. It's the sort of place that has a place that only sells desserts, like gourmet desserts, fancy, all sorts of cakes and ice creams and various things. And so, yeah, Britta Mart is a really good place for eating as well, and it's got a bit of heritage value. Karangahape Road, or K Road, as people generally refer to it, that's at the top end of the CBD. So if you walk south from downtown up the hill, that's a very trendy place as well for places to eat and bars, and it can be quite lively on a Friday or Saturday night. Ponsonby, I've already mentioned, that has got excellent places to eat all along that strip. Very nice cafes, very nice restaurants. There's an international food court that's very good, so there's good options there for eating. And then south of that is a street called Dominion Road. Dominion Road is basically Chinatown, but it also has lots of Indian restaurants and lots of other Asian restaurants. So particularly for a cheap eat, Dominion Road has got fantastic dumpling places and all sorts of different kind of varieties of food. It's a very multicultural city and lots of different food options. So plenty you won't go hungry in Auckland. And then just in terms of, I thought I mentioned briefly about getting around. So yeah, a car is useful for getting to the inner suburbs, but you can do a lot if you're downtown by catching either the bus or the ferry or the train. And they have a thing called the hop card. So like in London, you've got your Oyster card, and is it Hong Kong has the octopus card or something. So in Auckland, it's called a hop card, HOP. And so you buy one of those, you load it up with credit, and then you can use it pretty much on any part of the public transport network. Aucklanders do complain about the public transport, but it is actually good to certain locales. Where a lot of the population of Auckland live, like out in West Auckland, there are limited options there. But for the kind of places that you might want to visit as a tourist, it is an option. Or you might want to consider staying downtown for the first few days, and then you move out somewhere else, or then you pick up your hire car and go and explore the rest of the country.
Makes sense. Sure.
So that should keep you busy for a week in Auckland.
Excellent. Anything else we need to know before we book our ticket to Auckland?
I don't think so. Obviously, we're in the southern hemisphere, so the seasons are the other way round. So it's a great winter escape if you're in the northern hemisphere and you want to get to some sunshine and warmth. My recommendation, I always say,
in our summer, your winter in Auckland isn't very wintry, we should say. No, it's like winter in California.
Correct. It has never snowed in Auckland. It's a very temperate climate. So it never gets below freezing, never get frost. In the summer, you're looking at highs of high 20s, maybe up to 30, 32 degrees.
Okay.
And if you've not visited New Zealand before, because it's close to Antarctica and the hole in the ozone layer, although that is closing up a bit, the UV is extremely strong. So just from a sun protection, it really catches people out from the Northern Hemisphere who go, oh, it's just like being in, or maybe even like California, like equivalent temperature California versus New Zealand, you will get burnt much quicker in New Zealand. Just the UV. Yeah, so very much hats are a must bring. I remember when my dad visited for the first time, and he's like, oh, it's just like a sunny day in London. And then within half an hour, his face was bright red, and he's like, going to go buy a hat because you just need to be careful around the sun. But it's hot, but it never gets, it's not like Melbourne can get 40 degrees plus. That doesn't happen in Auckland. It's reasonably temperate.
Which for my Fahrenheit thinking friends is in the hundreds. So you're pretty hot at that point.
Exactly. So it's generally a nice temperature. I would recommend summer technically is December to February, but December is rarely summer these days. With climate change, everything's shifted back at least a month because everybody's complaining at Christmas time. The weather at Christmas is always rubbish in New Zealand and everybody's complaining about it's meant to be summer. To me, summer doesn't really start until January, and then the best months to visit are probably March, April, because January, February can be really quite hot or for UV protection. So I find March, April is not quite as hot, but the weather is more settled. So often, like spring is the worst time to visit New Zealand. So September, October, November is the windiest and most variable kind of weather in pretty much most parts, like certainly in Auckland, certainly in Wellington, spring is not the best time to visit. So I recommend late summer to autumn that's when I'd suggest. But as you say, even in winter, I mean, it gets a bit wet and damp, but it's not that cold compared to most places.
No, it really isn't. Especially for our listeners who are listening in places that really get snow in winter, like the Midwest.
Chicago in winter.
Chicago, yeah. In which case, New Zealand has no winter, at least this part of New Zealand. Excellent. As we go to wrap this up, you know my questions here. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Auckland. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I would be at the top of One Tree Hill, Mankakiki, at sunset. Any of the volcanoes are good at sunset, and I'd be looking out over the entirety of the city. I can see the Pacific Ocean to my north and the Hauraki Gulf and the various islands of Rangitoto. And then looking to my south, I can see the Manukau Harbour and the Tasman Ocean. And then looking to the west, I can see the Waitakere Ranges, beautiful temperate rainforest. And then looking to the east, I can see the coast probably at some point, probably some small hills to the east. But yeah, really beautiful views and just a very nice place to be.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Auckland.
Now, when you visited New Zealand, did you come across the expression Jaffa?
No.
So Aucklanders, more commonly called by their fellow New Zealanders, Jaffas. And it is a slightly derogatory term, but I think Aucklanders have embraced it as it's proud to be a Jaffa. So Jaffa stands for just another effing Aucklander. Because there's this thing, because New Zealand it's the classic big city versus the rest of the country. It's say 1 in 3 people in New Zealand live in Auckland, but a lot of people who don't live in Auckland will consider Auckland to be its own country. Like if you go down to the South Island, you go down to Dunedin, or if you go out to the rural areas of New Zealand, the same in all countries. If you're in the UK and you're in a rural area versus London, quite different. If you're in your rural US versus New York, quite different. And it's that similar kind of love-hate relationship, I think, with the big city.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize Auckland in just 3 words, what 3 words would you pick?
I'd say volcanoes, brackets extinct, so they're safe. I'd say sprawling. It is like the Los Angeles of New Zealand. It's not very dense. It's very spread out. It's quite sprawling. And then I think it's beautiful. Like you get such a variety of landscapes and scenery and some of the wild coast on the west coast and the beautiful beaches on the east coast. So it's, a lot of variety. This is a beautiful place. But a lot of people don't see, because if you always see is the downtown CBD, you're not really seeing Auckland.
Excellent. And our guest again is Jonty Crane. And I don't think we mentioned your website is Jonty, JONTYNZ or NZ.com. Thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Auckland.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you again, Chris.
And you started to say on Jonty NZ, we can find a lot of information about Auckland. What's the best post you have on Auckland?
Oh, I like one which I wrote. So just before I left Auckland to move down to Wellington, I did some reflecting on sort of 10 years in living there. And I've got one called Auckland's Lesser Known Gems. And some of the things I've mentioned in today's podcast are on there, but there's also a whole bunch of other stuff. There's some beautiful sculpture parks. There's some more native wildlife. There's some more reserves. There's some little out-the-way bays. So if you do have more time than a week, then that post would give you some good ideas for additional places that you might want to consider visiting.
Excellent. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And Jonty, thanks so much for coming back on Amateur Traveler, and this time for sharing with us your love for Auckland.
Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
A special thanks to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. This is my day job now, and I appreciate what they do. If you're interested in learning what you can get by being a patron of the show, or just how you can support the show, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. I hope you enjoyed this episode again with Jonty, and if you enjoy him, you're in luck because he's actually going to come on and do a special episode, one of those bonus episodes on the treks in New Zealand. So this is a little different than our usual format, but I think you'll like that show, and that's coming up here sometime in the next month. I am just back from Japan, flew in last night, one of those 40-hour days as you're doing that transit. You'll hear more about that next week, trip that I did with Walk Japan while I was there. And then I'm off to Victoria, British Columbia. But as this comes out, I'm going to be touring Victoria, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks as well. But with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to chris2x@gmail.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but baby, now